Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you, and we're chatting to Bridget Welsh from the Asia Research Institute at the University of Nottingham Malaysia, talking about the upcoming Tanjung Piai by-election. Of course, the nomination day is tomorrow. We'll find out who will be, I guess, the official candidates. But for now, we know roughly that Pakatan Harapan's candidate is Karmaini Sardini. Barisan Nasional will be fielding two-time Tanjung Piai MP Wijek Singh, and Gerakan is fielding its Deputy Secretary General Wendy Subramaniam. Talk to us, Bridget, about the importance of a local status for by-elections. I mean, for the Pakatan Harapan candidate, we had a lot of comments saying he's a local boy. It's important that he be a local boy. We heard the same for the MCA candidate as well. How important is it that there's a local status involved?
Well, I think in kind of semi-rural, semi-urban seats, this has it's more urban than rural, but it still has elements that having access to their MP, knowing who that person is a criteria that is important. And I think they use that as part of the packaging in terms of identifying and making connections to the electorate, because people will know them and know their character, know their standing. It also affects the machinery of political parties. So if you don't have a local candidate, then what happens is that the local party machinery who've in a sense been sidelined by not being part of being chosen, are also may feel more reluctant to help to mobilize on the candidate's behalf.
Yeah, and I'm wondering about that, because it seems sometimes that perhaps party political considerations trump the public perception or reception of a candidate. So for instance, with the Pakatan Harapan, they've got a stalwart of a party, political party stalwart. He in many ways represents the old dispensation, former UMNO, now Bersatu, so on and so forth. But the idea that Pakatan was going to bring new blood into politics in Malaysia, is that often going to be sacrificed because you need to reward party workers?
Well, it's not just about rewarding. I think there is a fact that there is bringing local representation into government at the center is a very important component about making it inclusive.
But that local person could have been young. It could have been. It could have been somebody who represented a new thinking about politics, not somebody who's been there, a veteran, and always seems to be older people that at least in terms of the Pakatan and Barisan candidates, the older people who get the nomination.
I think there are two issues here, right? One is that whether or not it's local or parachuted in, all right? Okay, so I think that is, I think the choice of a local is stronger than a parachute in that context. And parties do parachute in candidates all the time. And we didn't see that in this by-election, which I think is an important, I think, more democratic practice. The second issue is the generation, basically kind of more incumbent type of element of being part of the system versus somebody new. The reality is that because the stakes of this election are high, or at least, they're not do or die, but they're high, I think they went with safe options. And I think they didn't take risks that would have included younger candidates, more dynamic, with the exception of Gerakan. Gerakan's candidate is younger and a female.
And maybe it's time to talk about them, because why is Gerakan in this race?
Well, I think
the question everyone's asking.
Well, I think for Gerakan, they are looking for an opportunity to distinguish themselves in a post-BN environment. So they're no longer part of Barisan Nasional. They are choosing to try to return themselves to a profile and to change the discussion of what sort of issues that we don't want to be part of these sort of political interactions and alliances. At the same time, we're not part of the incumbent government. So they're positioning themselves.
So is their presence, the candidates contending in this by-election, there to split votes between Pakatan and Barisan Nasional?
Well, there are two ways to look at it, right? I mean, there's one to think about it very pragmatically as a spoiler effect in terms of and I think of the two that they're probably most likely going to negatively affect BN and capture some of the anti-Pakistan sentiment that might have gone to Barisan in that context. But I think there's another side to it, is that, you know, as a party, they have pretty much become irrelevant in the they have no representation in terms of parliament. So this puts them back on the stage. And a by-election, given the media attention, gets them recognition, or people thinking about them as a political force.
The likelihood of Gerakan becoming a third force in the Malaysian political scenario heading into GE15, Bridget?
I think, if anything, it will have to be part of other groups of actors.
Okay, going at it alone may not be the best thing.
Well, the reality is a third force that moves needs to be somebody that reaches out across. But I think what will be interesting to watch are the narratives that are used in this campaign. If they use it and say, oh, we're the one not with PAS and others, or do they talk about having a different vision for Malaysia in a different way, then I think those are going to be markers of how much they're going to be a future player.
Right, in fact, you might argue that at this point in time, we already have a third force in the form of the Sarawak-based parties. Barisan is actually only friendly to Pakatan and not, in fact, formally part of the coalition. So perhaps Gerakan could be a fourth force. But the fact that they've chosen a woman who's bicultural, and I think that, do you think they exemplify the kind of risk-taking that the standard sort of parties are now fearing to take? You know, going with women, going with somebody younger, somebody who's ethnically ambiguous. She's both Indian and Chinese and speaks Mandarin, so on and so forth.
Well, I wouldn't say she's ambiguous. She's multicultural, right?
Yes.
In that situation. But I think it's not about. Look, as I said just now, Gerakan has everything to win by being there, because as they say, no publicity, bad publicity or good publicity is still publicity, right? And they didn't have any before they were part of this election. That said, I think it does speak to the fact that she's a professional, she's a lawyer, she's I think quite articulate, and it will be. I'm interested to watch what she speaks in the narrative about the campaign, and how those sets of issues of being multicultural, how she envisions a different Malaysia.
I do want to mention something that you wrote in that opinion piece you put out, Bridget. You mentioned that gender was an issue. You mentioned that in this seat particularly, gender voting patterns was something that you paid attention to. Can you elaborate a little bit more, especially now that we also have a candidate who is a young woman, young professional woman?
Well, there are two things here. First is that, you know, traditionally, those of us who look at voting behavior, at least in the scholarship, the focus heavily is on just using a racial lens to understand voting. And I think as we understand this, the fact of the matter is voting is much more than race. There are generational issues, regional issues, gender issues that help to account for different voting shifts. And this seat, I use this article to talk about some of the elements that were different, generational dimensions as well as gender dimensions. And traditionally, BN has had an advantage among women, especially UMNO among Malay women.
Why is that?
Well, I think, first of all, it goes back to the Wanita UMNO has always been traditionally been a very strong branch. I think one of the things that we saw under the previous government, under Najib, especially that the Wanita UMNO really deteriorated as an organization. So some of those advantages of having among women were actually have been lost. Also, we see PAS has also been very weak with embracing women in terms of the Malay community, in part because of gender dimensions of representation within PAS itself. But we see in this particular seat, the women voted for the opposition at that time, which was Pakatan Rakyat or others in 2008, and that was just not the norm. So I was like, wow, this is different. And then what we saw is that it moved to a more equal situation, and then we saw what we saw in GE14, which is that women tended to vote for BN slightly more. Now, then we ask the question is what putting a woman candidate does. All right, and the sad thing is that studies traditionally show that women don't vote for women.
Women don't vote for women.
As much as you think that they do, right? And that you would think that that would be an element in that context. But in fact, traditionally it doesn't. And this is where I think it's going to be an interesting test, whether or not the gender dimensions come in. And you know, she has that card to play. The others don't. But I also, I mean, women are I think 49.5% of the seats. So it's an equal split. So they're going to have to win over women in order to win the seat.
There you go. Fascinating. We're going to continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Don't go anywhere. Right here on Consider This.